Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our 2 o'clock panel. I am privileged to be able to announce my next two guests, one whom I've recently had an interview with, and one whom I've been fortunate enough to get 3 or 4 con sketches from over the course of my art collecting career. I'd like to welcome Scott Dunbier and Walt Simonson. Welcome, guys.
Hey, folks.
How's it going?
All right. Well, I'm gonna check out and be a fan and enjoy the conversation, everybody.
All right. Hey, Walter, how you doing?
Hey, Scott. How's it going?
Good, good. So, what are we doing here exactly?
Yeah, I think you asked me to be on the panel, and I have no. After that, I'm done.
That's right. That's right. So, so this is the first one of these things that I've done. Bill was kind enough to invite me to do this, and I'm going to be doing some sort of just talks with old friends like you, but you're the first, so congratulations. All right.
Well, I'll try to do the best.
So, Walter, first, you actually sort of drew your first comic book before you were professional. You did Star Slammers at RISD at Rhode Island.
To be strictly accurate, I tried drawing my first comic when I was around 6 or 7.
Right.
I'd read some little golden books I loved, and I decided I would do a modest comic. I drew it on manila paper. I do not have it anymore. I would give a nickel to still have the original, because I don't have any pictures or anything like that. But I drew it on manila paper and pencil. I colored it with crayons, I suppose. I don't remember. And
Sure.
I actually stuck it in my father's typewriter and tried to type the caption because I felt I couldn't print well enough at that point to make it look professional. And that was hard. It was hard to get it and fit in that space, and
Sure.
and inside the captions, and this is the old manual typewriters. So you had to turn the roller to get it to work. And
Send it back that way.
the comic was modestly called "The Origin of Life." And it was a nonfiction documentary about how life came to be, taken from some of the books, little kid books that I'd read about Volvoxes and single-celled animals and stuff like that. I got about a page and a half into it before I finally ran out of gas and just collapsed. But when I was in college, my first school, I was a geology major. I began reading Marvel comics. I'd read them as a kid. I read a ton of comics as a kid. Not Marvel, but they weren't around then. But I discovered Marvel when I was in college. And so I began drawing little scraps of stories. I did a 4-page Doctor Strange. I got that far before I ran out of gas. I would run out of gas, but I would run out of gas a little further along each time. So I had a 4-page Doctor Strange and about a 6 or 7-page Iron Man versus Titanium Man. Eventually I did an Enemy Ace that I did about 4 or 5 pages on, and then eventually I did another 3 or 4 to kind of fill it out. I'm not sure I finished that one either. And ultimately I drew about a 30 or 35-page Thor story. By this time I was in art school, and I didn't finish that one, but I got about 35 pages of inks done before I packed that one in. And in that case, I decided to quit doing it because I didn't like the inking I was doing. And I thought, I'm going to come back to this when I can ink better. And 14 years later, I was working at Marvel Comics. I got the chance to do Thor. My inks were better, so I told the same story. I told that story in more detail, which was the Surtur saga that I did. But I did do when I was at art school, my junior and senior year, so it would have been 70 through 72, I did a strip called The Star Slammers, which became my portfolio when I went to get work in New York. And it was my degree project for RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, which is where I was going to art school. So I did that was about 50 pages long, something like that. And that was a complete project. That's probably the first one I did. I think it is the first.
There were several pamphlets, right?
What's that? Say what? I'm sorry, Scott. I missed that last question. Are we still on? Are you hearing me?
I said there were. Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah,
okay.
You were out for a little bit, but and the thing you did at RISD, that was the Star Slammers thing at RISD, that was several pamphlets, wasn't it? Like 4 pamphlets.
It was published. Yes, it was. I guess they didn't call them Ashcan editions back then, but it was probably like Ashcan editions, where they were printed up in a guy's basement on he had a little offset machine apparently, never saw it. I just had the results. And it was done as a publicity stunt, really, for a science fiction club in Washington, D.C., the WISFA, the Washington Science Fiction Association. And it was a promotion. The club was bidding to hold the WorldCon, the World Science Fiction Convention, in Washington, D.C. in 1974. There were other cities that were bidding. And so I began the comic really as a promotional tool for the club. They would print up these they were 8-page pamphlets. Basically, it was copier paper, typewriter paper, folded over, and then stapled 2 sheets. So you had a cover, 6 inside pages, and a back cover. And it took me about 4 issues to figure out how to best use that space. And then I did a series of chapters, maybe 7 chapters altogether, something like that. The last one was a double issue, and they were printed, collated, stapled, and then anybody who was in the club who was going to a convention somewhere else in the country, and there were plenty of them, Lunacon, WesterCon, things like the old conventions in the old days, would grab a mitt full of the Star Slammers pamphlets and old issues and the new one, and carry them off to the conventions and toss them on the freebie table and that's how they were distributed. So I haven't seen those much. I know I first got into comics, I saw some to sign, but I haven't seen those much in a long time.
Right.
And they won the bid, so I claim total credit for having getting Washington the World Science Fiction Con in '74.
Sure. I'm sure you had something to do with it. Maybe. So after you graduated, that was 1972, right?
That's right, from RISD, yes.
Yeah, and then you started going around applying at various companies. DC was the first one that you talked to, right?
Yeah, I really only applied to one company because I got work when I applied. So it was DC. I had been really a Marvel fan, and in a lot of ways, I'm kind of more, well, from the old days anyway, a Marvel guy than a DC guy. As far as the comics that I read Marvel's religiously during the mid 60s, 65 to 69. I read everything they put out, which in the 65 was like 9 titles or whatever it was, so it wasn't a lot, and I could afford it at college. But by the end of the 60s, I found that Marvel they were kind of repeating the stories they'd done. Galactus came back for the 3rd time, and the Thing became a bad guy thanks to the Wizard for the 2nd time. And I'd read those stories, and I wasn't as interested in them. I found myself losing some interest. I still bought them for a while. But about that same time, late 60s, DC started putting out some really interesting comics, Enemy Ace being a prime example. In the early 70s, they picked up the Burroughs adaptations. Joe Kubert did Tarzan, which was just spectacular. My favorite Tarzan in comics, I think. And they had a bunch of the, John Carter of Mars, Carson of Venus, and then the other ones, on the Ape and the Creeper by Ditko. So none of them, I think, of those lasted very long, but they were really interesting. And to me, they were way more interesting than what Marvel was doing at that time. And so I began reading more DCs as a result. Marv Wolfman wrote 2 issues of the Blackhawks, where he took the Blackhawks back to their old outfits after a really strange superhero period that was extremely odd and very not painful. Great. And I thought those were great. And then, of course, they only did 2 issues. Pat Boyette drew them, and then they folded, and that was the end of that. But Bat Lash was coming out. That was a great comic by Nick Cardy, Denny O'Neil. The Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and Dead Man, actually, by Neil. Who wrote those? Did Denny write those, the later ones? I can't remember. I don't think he wrote the first one.
The first one was written by Arnold Drake, I think.
Arnold Drake. But I like Dead Man a lot. I wish that had kept going and actually had a complete story. So I read a lot of those. So when I came to New York in 72, I graduated in May. I came in New York in early August, the beginning of August. I had a summer job for 2 months. And then I, I went to DC first with my portfolio, because those are the comics I was reading and thought were the most interesting. And that's why I went there. And I was lucky enough to walk out of there with a job. So that was really the beginning of my professional career.
It really was an exciting time in comics. I mean, all those titles you mentioned, one thing that was, really the center point of it was so many great new artists were walking in the door. In the Burroughs stuff, you had guys like Alan Weiss, Mike Kaluta, actually
Dan Green.
Yeah, all that stuff. And then Howard Chaykin was breaking in then. Plus you had
Iron Wolf. He was doing Iron Wolf right when I came into New York. Sort of sorcery. I mean, there was a period there in the 60s where I don't think a lot of new guys came in. Denny came in, Archie came in, Roy a little earlier, but there weren't a ton. And then in 67, from 67 on for a few years, there was really quite a wave. I think that began with guys like Bernie and Kaluta, and Starlin, Chaykin, Weiss, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, writers as well, Steve Englehart. I think Steve Skates came in there at some point. And so there was quite a wave. I kind of felt at the time, I don't remember enough anymore to get this right, but I remember when I came in August of 72, I felt like I was about the last guy of that wave to enter in about that 5-year period. Now, within a couple of years, there were new guys like Terry Austin, Bob Wycheck were getting in as well. So from that point on, it was less a wave and more kind of a general trickle that was coming into the business, or maybe even a flood. But there had been a flood earlier, and a lot of really talented artists and writers had gotten into comics. So it made it a great time to be doing comics. That was just a great time to be in the business.
Let me ask you a question though. Were there one or two people that were the ones at DC that were driving it? Like I always imagine that Joe Orlando and Joe Kubert had a hand in some of the new guys breaking in.
I think they did. I think they had a lot to do with some of that. I will say that I was probably more focused on the freelancers than on the editors mostly, because the freelancers, the ones I knew, they were my age. So we were kind of a little younger, but roughly. And so we were part of the same social set. At DC, the editors were all a little older. They got a little younger as time went by. Dave Manick became one of the editors there for a while. I've forgotten who. Well, Milgram was there. Larry Hama was there. A lot of those guys got booted when the DC implosion happened. That was later in the 70s. But there were younger guys who came in as well. But when I first got into comics, it was Julie Schwartz. It was Joe Orlando, Murray. Oh, my brain's gone away. Who am I talking about? Murray
Boltinoff.
Bolton. And there may have been others as well. But they were clearly a generation or two ahead of me. So we weren't social hangers out. And I will say that I rarely hung out in their offices. Later on, when I was over at Marvel and all the editors were my age or even a little bit younger, I would hang out the editors' offices a lot and bother them and keep them from working. But at DC, it was a little more formal than that. Mostly, you were more aware of somebody like Bernie Wrightson, who was setting the bar really for the rest of us. He was so far ahead of what we were doing that it was a challenge to keep up and a challenge to try and get good enough to be up there. And by the time he got there, Bernie had gone on up here. And by the time you caught up there, he was up here. And so he was really, I think, a pace setter in a lot of ways for a lot of us who were around them. But there were a lot of good guys doing comics at that time. And it was really, it was a very creative business in a way where if you were in the writing or the drawing and the comics, you got to do a lot of creative stuff. It was great.
It's funny when you mention trying to keep up with your peers and being inspired and being pushed to do better work. I've heard the same thing from several of the old EC guys. Like Al Williamson used to say that for them it was Wally Wood. That when Wally Wood would bring in a job, they'd go, "Oh Jesus," but it would push them to do better work, and guys who cared about it.
Well, I can remember being in the office one of the things I loved about the old days that you can't do now is everyone had to bring in their originals into the office. They either lived in the New York City area and brought them into the offices, or they would mail them in. Some of the guys lived in California. The older guys, younger guys, pretty much had to live in New York. You weren't really established enough yet to go somewhere else. John Buscema was out on Long Island. Alex Toth was California, I think. John Severn was in Colorado, I believe. Yeah, never met John. But sometimes the jobs would come in, you'd see them. And I can still remember being in the office when Alex Toth's job, Burma Skies, came into the office. Yeah. And we were all just standing around. I cannot now, as an old man, open my jaw as wide as I did at the time. We're all sitting there going, because it was just an astounding job. And Alex was using early felt tip markers like Pentels, stuff like that, to scumble along the edge, to give some tone along the edge of it. That stuff's probably all turned red by now. None of that stuff was archival back in those days. But it was still, you could see the art. I saw some Joe Kubert jobs. You would just see this art. And, Bernie was inspiring. I don't mean to suggest he wasn't. But, boy, you'd see some of the stuff the old pros turned in. It was just great to be able to actually hold those originals and look at them and see what those guys were doing and be inspired by it. And now one of the things I really miss is that atmosphere. It was both a competition and a camaraderie to see the work everybody was turning in.
Well, also you guys, a lot of you guys lived together, were roommates. And wasn't there a building in Queens where there were several different apartments?
Pretty much all the young guys had to live in the New York City area because you had to be able to get into the office to really bring your pages in and hand them to the editor. So you knew everybody. I knew all the guys in my generation. I was, really close friends with a handful, and the rest of them I knew. And didn't see all that much. Starlin lived in the city, in Manhattan, so I didn't see Jim much. But for a time, 74, 75 into early 76, Alan Milgram and I were roommates. Another guy who came in in that crowd in the early 70s. But Alan Milgram and I were roommates. And for a time, we were on the 4th floor of an apartment building in Rego Park in Queens. And Howard Chaykin moved into the building. And he moved in, literally, we were in a 2-man apartment. And he was just around the corner past the stairwell in like a studio apartment. And then for about a year, Bernie Wrightson. Bernie moved downstairs 2 floors below Howard, right below in the same apartment line. And so he was down there. And I've said this before, that about 3 a.m, we all worked late. We all worked into the night because the phone doesn't ring. Nobody had answering machines back then anyway. But it was really quiet and you get a lot done. And about 2 or 3 a.m, they'd come over to our apartment. I would make popcorn, and we all had popcorn and sit around and shoot the breeze. I do not remember what we said. I don't remember those conversations. Howard might. Howard's a good memory for conversations. Sure. We just talked about everything. And, it was, I remember thinking at the time, wow, I know that in years to come, I'm going to look back and I'm going to say, wow, these were the good old days. And they were. Sure. So it was a lot of fun. Bernie was there about a year, and then he moved out, I think, to Kansas City. And Howard was there a little bit longer. Then he moved into Manhattan. And I was there with Alan until I moved in with my girlfriend in Manhattan in early 76, I think. Something like that. I have to go back and double check. Might have been 72, 73, 74, 75. I have to think about that one. But somewhere in there.
It's funny you mentioned that you have a bad memory. You actually have, or that Howard has a better memory. You actually have a great memory because I'm sure you don't. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe you do remember this.
Ginger ale, folks. Just ginger ale.
Well, this is vodka. So.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, me, the heavy drinker.
Pass one off as beer, I suppose. But.
Now, do you remember when we first met the first time?
I don't. I know you have told me about it, but I do not remember.
Are you there?
I'm still here. You can hear me?
Well.
Yep.
Actually, Howard. Yeah, now I can. Yeah, okay. Howard actually introduced us because I had met Howard at a show, and he took me up. This is probably 83. I remember I met him at a show because I walked up to who was the guy who started first? Was that Mike Gold?
He was an editor there, yeah, editor in chief, whatever Mike was. Yeah, he wasn't the owner.
Well,
but yeah.
I walked up to a table, and he was there, and he was talking to somebody who I knew who he was, but I didn't. I never really spoke to him very much. But I talked to Mike, and I just said, first words out of my mouth were, "So I'm looking forward to First Comics. When are you going to give Alex Toth work?" And Howard, you can imagine Howard's reaction. And he just looked at me and he goes, "I've been telling this putz that for the last 2 hours, you know." But so Howard took me up to Upstart, and that's where I met you.
Right.
And then the part about the memory comes in. About a year later, I was with Sean McManus, who was my roommate at the time, and we were in the city. We lived in Brooklyn, but we came into the city and we went to Coliseum Books on 56th Street.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked over, and you were there and you were looking at some books, and I said, "Oh, hey, Walter," and completely about to start to introduce myself, and you just turn around and go, "Oh, hey, Scott." To this day, that shocks me. I mean, a year later, I have no idea. I must have made some kind of an impression. But,
you must have been very memorable, because I do not always remember people's names. But you were very memorable.
Bad at that. But anyway, let's start showing some artwork and start talking about stuff. And we don't need to go in a linear way. Anything in particular you'd like to start with? You want to talk about?
Well, I know you wanted to talk about the Cape and Calla Death Trap, and I'm happy to do that at the start there if you want.
Sure, that sounds good. And this was in Detective 450. And Bill, if you could maybe show,
There you go.
So this is one of my favorite jobs by you, because it was done just after Manhunter ended, less than a year. And I always thought it was just the craziest job. I mean, you know, the Batman really takes on, you know, the personification of a demon. I mean, he looks like he's 4 feet tall. And then if you look at that second page, I picked this page because of that bottom left panel. You know, I mean, it's such a departure. You know, I mean, Batman's literally transforming as he's on the phone with Commissioner Gordon. You know, and it just killed me. And the inking, look at the inking on the bottom right panel. That's just gorgeous stuff. Anyway, let's go on to the next set. And again, you know, just great storytelling, beautiful art. You know, really, you know, it looks like your work, obviously, but it looks a little bit different with the storytelling. And then that last page there, with the cape and cowl over the chair, and the guy literally is saying, "It took a devil from hell to catch me," and that's sort of the feel from the story. I mean, do you feel this was a sort of a part of your career where you sort of took a step forward, or just tried something different?
Something different. That there were several things going on. One is that by this time, what year did this come out? 76, 75?
75.
75. My girlfriend, whom I eventually married, was working by then at Warren. And I'd read a lot of the Warren magazines in their early days, and hadn't seen them for a while. I was seeing them again. And by the time this job came out, Jim was using a lot of European artists. He cut a deal with 210 over in Spain, and who represented a number of artists. One of the artists that he used was Jose Ortiz. And Ortiz was great. He was just really loose, wonderful drawing, full of chiaroscuro, a lot of texture, a lot of shading would go around the corner of things, the light and the dark melding, a lot of black in the panels. I loved it. I thought it was just fabulous stuff. And it was really antithetical to the kind of really clean stuff I had developed in Manhunter. So when I did that story, I was heavily influenced by Ortiz's stuff. I was trying to do an Ortiz without actually drawing like Ortiz, which I don't. I was trying to do a sort of an Ortiz job. That's why there's so scribbly and so much texture and all that kind of stuff going on. I had a theory at the time. This wouldn't be true anymore, but I thought it was true at the time, that of all the mainstream characters, Batman sort of had the most variation. Now, of course, every character has new costumes every 20 minutes. It's a toy catalog when you read new comics all the time. But at that time, that was not true. But Batman had a history where a variety of different artists, from Bob Kane to Dick Sprang to Neil Adams, had drawn him, and they all had very different takes on what the character looked like. And I thought that was really cool. The way I expressed it was, there's the Platonic theory of forms, where somewhere out there in the ether there is a perfect form for every object, and somewhere out there there's a perfect Batman form. But in reality, the realities of things reflect those perfect forms, but they reflect them imperfectly. And so there's a perfect Batman out there somewhere, and all these different Batmen that you see are different reflections of that one eternal form, if you will. And so I thought of all the characters. Batman, there was a form out there, but there were all these different variations, and it lent itself to experimentation, to try and figure out different ways to get a hold of the character. And so I had already done a kind of a long, lean Batman with ears out to here. He had a cape in some panels that was a mile long. That's because Bernie Wrightson and I had a competition briefly for who would draw the longest cape on Batman. Bernie did him in Swamp Thing with a beautiful silk cape that flowed out beyond him, and the wind was behind him, standing at the top of the building. Fabulous drawing. And the cape was clearly made of the finest silk. And so I did a cape that was like 8 miles long, made of like 40 weight canvas. I don't know how he stood up on the beam he was on, but it was really, that's the stuff that inspired you at the time. And that was something that the two of us did that was fun. But I had done that Batman, kind of a karate guy. I had one leaping shot where he was kicking somebody, whatever. And so I wanted to do a different Batman. It was a job for Julie Schwartz. As far as I could tell, I think Julie hated the job. It was so antithetical to what he liked. And at the same time, my work wasn't what Julia liked in general. We got along fine. But I don't know if I would even do that now. I don't know if I would step that far out from what an editor was looking for. I was young and full of hubris, I guess, at the time. And so it was actually a little unusual for me, because mostly, especially back in those days, if I was doing a job, I kept in mind what had gone before, and to some extent tried to be true to it. I picked up Hercules Unbound after Jose Garcia Lopez had done 6 issues. Woody was inking it. And I had not met Jose at the time. I didn't know his work before that. That's the first work of his I saw. And so I tried to do layouts, at least initially, that were not too far out of line with what Jose had done in that book. With Woody inking it, it all kind of looked like Woody anyway, so that was okay. It all kind of tied together. But I thought stuff should be tied together visually. So, but in Batman's case, I think I just thought, well, he's looked different a dozen times already, if not 20 or 30 times. So what the heck? So that was why I went a very different direction. It was a short, squat, kind of a fascist Batman, kind of a killer man. One shot where he's beating the heck out of this guy, where he's banging on him. And I've got little round blebs flying over it, which are, clearly blood, but, they didn't really do much blood in comics back at that time. Sure. I think it's possible. I don't remember for sure now. I have to look at my notes. I may have colored that job, in which case, if I did, I put red in the little blobs. But I colored a few of my early jobs. I colored the last 2 or 3 Manhunters. Eventually, I gave up doing that because I found that it's very difficult to make choices about the color. I mean, it was hard. It was a lot of work. And, of course, coloring didn't pay all that well, and I wasn't quick at it. I enjoyed it, and I like having a hand in everything in the comic. Sure. But it was just, it took too much time for me to really be, as they say, cost effective. And so I finally kind of gave it up. I called it a few other oddball jobs here and there, but not a lot. But that's really where that look came from. I decided I'd done a long-eared Batman. I was trying to do a short-eared Batman, stocky, a guy that could go out there and kick ass and take names. The other thing I remember, we used to gather reference. There was no web back then. So you just, you got the reference you could. And at one point, I don't remember how I did this, because I would have been reluctant to have put my name out there for this, but I ended up maybe just in the junk mail. I got a couple of Fredericks of Hollywood catalogs, which had, drawings of very elongated babes in revealing outfits. I mean, some of them were actual dresses along with the underwear and everything else. But I think that the girl that's in the room with Bruce Wayne in that drawing is wearing a Fredericks of Hollywood outfit, or at least it's a Fredericks of Hollywood inspired outfit, which I thought was probably cheesy, but it just made me laugh at the time.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions. You a lot of times do the display lettering yourself, and it looks to me like you did the lettering, the title of the story, and maybe even the credits. It looks like you maybe drew them, or is that who?
Oh, I probably did do the credits. It's kind of small on my computer, but those look like mine. I don't, it's not big enough for me to be able to look at the small letters. I lettered a couple of my jobs too. That again became non-cost effective. It took me too long. I didn't letter very much, and it took me too long to practice to get back to at least a modicum of professionalism. Because I did letter when I first got into comics, or I had practiced at art school. But in this one, I did do all the display lettering. Any job that I inked back in those days, probably up until about 1979, if I inked it, I drew all the panel borders, I drew all the balloon borders. I did all the display lettering, whether it was the titles or the sound effects or anything else.
Do you remember who lettered this job?
Pardon?
Do you remember who lettered this job?
No, I'd have to go. If it's not credited, again, I can't really.
Maybe John Costanza or Gaspar?
I would have no idea. I'd have to look. It's remotely possible I did myself, but I can't. It isn't big enough on this shot for me to be able to get a look at the letter forms. And if it's not me, and it may very well not be, I have no idea. But the credits are certainly mine.
Well, in a minute, we'll go to your skinny Batman. But first, I wanted to tell you a funny story. You mentioned Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, who's one of my favorite artists, one of the best artists in comics.
He's one of all of our favorite artists.
Yeah, but you talked about when jobs would come in and you would fawn over them. I was up at the DC offices when Brian Boland visited one day, and Jose was there, and Brian, who's a pretty reserved guy, just went up to him and said, "Oh man, I really love your work. I love your work." And Jose, who, for those of you who haven't met him, is, besides being a great artist, is just a very humble, wonderful person. And he was like, well, thank you. Thank you very much. But
I can imagine.
But now let's go to that skinny Batman in a minute. When the first work I saw by you was the second chapter of Manhunter, and it blew me away. And I had to go back and search at a couple of different places. There was one comic shop in my neighborhood, one of the first comic shops, called Super Snipe, and they didn't have it. And so I had to go around and find it from a friend. It turns out I had a friend who had it, and we traded, and so I got the comic. But I was 11 years old when that came out, and to this day, and Walter, I know this is old news for you. To this day, it remains my favorite finite comic series of all time. The work that you and Archie did on it. I can quote the dialogue. I remember panels vividly. It's just, which I'll probably do in the next minute when we show some art. Actually, why don't we show the first Manhunter slide? All right. So on the left is the table of contents for the last chapter of Manhunter in Detective 443, which is just a really cool image. And the image on the right, it's funny you didn't draw the one issue that was the feature-length story with Batman teaming up with Manhunter. You didn't get to do the cover. It was actually done by Jim Aparo.
That's right.
But this was the 1983 reprint cover that you did, which to my mind, wasn't one of the best reprints because it was on fairly. Oh wait, was this the Baxter issue?
It was a Baxter reprint.
Okay, is this the one that Klaus colored? Klaus Janson?
Yes, I think he did color that one.
Okay. The coloring was beautiful, but the paper they picked for it was just terrible. It just made it feel, I don't know. I like the original coloring in the comic better than I did the way it printed. I mean, Klaus's coloring was beautiful, but the printing on that wasn't great, at least to me. If we go to the next slide, we have 2 pages from, well, the one on the left is chapter 4, The Splash, which is such a beautiful chapter, such a great story. I mean, the two main characters are being hunted in an alleyway, and that's a Jeep coming towards them. And this one, this is when it really went, I just went, holy cow, when I saw that and when I read it. And then the page on the right, talking about quoting lines, the stuff that Archie did, that this is the final 3-page fight scene between Manhunter and Asana, who is trying to bring him in for the council to kill him. And I mean, the action on these pages, let's go to the last slide. I mean, just the dialogue, the passion. I mean, when he says on the top left, "You have learned well, Paul," blah, blah, blah. And then he compliments him. And at the end, it just says, "Know if there is an advantage in this battle, it is that of mere years of training pitted against that of a lifetime." I just love this stuff, It's so, I mean, and it doesn't feel corny to me, even after all this time, Anyway, so, and the next page, he learns the truth about the council and all is good. But this is probably my favorite chapter. I mean, I know a lot of people talk a lot about the Cathedral one, and that's a great one, and I know it won whatever the awards were back then.
The Shazam Awards.
Right, which I think you won like 4 awards, right? Best feature length,
the series,
best short story, and most promising newcomer.
We won. Well, between Archie and me, we won 6 awards altogether.
Yeah.
Jim Starlin and I tied for the best newcomer, so we both got best newcomer in '73, and then we won Archie and I won best short story, I think, for the first chapter of Manhunter. And then the year later, we won Best Short Story again for the Cathedral Perilous story. And we won Best Long Story for the final chapter of Manhunter, the last one, which was a full-length comic. Great. And Archie won Best Writer 2 years in a row. We thought probably on the basis of Manhunter. So between us, we took home 6 awards for 7 chapters, which wasn't too bad.
Actually, why don't you tell the story, for those who don't know it, about when Archie accepted the award for Cathedral and went up, and who was there presenting the award.
Oh, you should tell that, because I wasn't there for the award. Actually,
neither was I.
But I mean, I just know the bare bones of it. You may know more of it than I know as far as that goes.
I only know because of the that introduction that Archie wrote. So
that's pretty much why I know.
So basically, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, then. Basically, you and Archie were talking about the story, and you decided to, or Archie had an idea about, not ripping off, but came up with an idea that was sort of based on a couple of old ideas by Will Eisner, and so and I think he wrote that you both chuckled. Well, it's a backup. Eisner will never see this anyway. And then that year, hosting the awards, of course, was Will Eisner. And Archie wrote that he felt he went up there and thanked everyone and sort of felt a little embarrassed, but I don't know. I think that's
on that story. The truth is that at the time I didn't know Eisner's stuff. I had seen I'd seen the Eisner job that Jules Pfeiffer reprinted in the Great Comic Book Heroes, which was
It's a great
an earlier Spirit story before his style really became what it became. And I had seen maybe a 5-page oversize Spirit story he did in the 60s after the Great Blackout in New York and on the East Coast that ran in one of the New York papers. It wasn't. I think a different paper than we have now. It was in a magazine, and he ran. It was a plot to kidnap Mayor Lindsay.
Sunday
tied into and it was great. And I had seen a very few of the earliest Spirits, the first ones, because somebody back then, I don't remember who, was putting out little tiny black and white and tone reprints. And they were going to do the whole series. It ran like 5 issues and then folded with whatever their magazine was. And I had subscribed to it. I'd heard of the Spirit, never really seen it. So, on the other hand, Archie, in the early Manhunters, Archie did breakdowns. He had thumbnails for all of it, and then wrote his script from his thumbnails. I think a usual procedure for him. So in the early stories, I had a full script to work from and Archie's thumbnails. In the last stories, I was doing the breakdowns. We were working Marvel style. We worked DC style in the early, Marvel style at the end. I don't know when we switched over. So I don't myself claim a giant Eisner influence other than really through Archie, where I got it, because Archie was aware of that material. I think structuring the stories to some extent. I mean, partly Cathedral Perilous happened because I passed St. Bartholomew's all the time on Park Avenue in New York, which is this fabulously beautiful Episcopal church. And I wanted to draw it. I thought it'd be great to draw that. And the other thing, actually, a little more serious, I had a good friend, another RISD graduate, who was a couple of years behind me. I just knew him after I was out of RISD. I got to know him in New York when he came to New York for a winter program from RISD and became a really close friend. And he had a much younger brother. Brett he would have been 20 when I knew him. And the brother was a kid, really. And his brother was Nico. I don't know if his full name was Nicholas. I don't remember anymore. But he was killed in a boating accident at about that time. And he'd been a big comic book reader.
Oh.
And Brett asked me if I thought maybe I could work Nico into a panel somewhere.
So he's the kid.
Because he read comics. And he thought Nico would like that if he could actually, was in a comic. And I talked to Archie. Archie structured the whole story around the kid, which was great. And then I used, I was a big fan of George Price, the New Yorker cartoonist. Love his drawing. One of the first 2 artists whose name I ever knew. I knew him. I knew Charles R. Knight, who did dinosaur reproductions, restorations. And but Price had a book out. My parents had when I was about 10 years old called Characters. There were a lot of reprint books of his material. Very straight line, very open drawing, little tone work, no black. And he had a great cartoon when the New York World's Fair was on in 63, something like that, 4. And they had for a while in the early World's Fairs, they had these little vehicles with a slant strut going up, a little roof over them, 2 seats in the front, and then a little driver's seat in the back. And the driver would be back there driving around through the thing, and you'd sit on it. It was like People Movie. You'd sit in the front and get driven around. And they were sponsored by Greyhound. So they had this really awful horn that would go, whamp, 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 which was the music from the Greyhound TV commercials back then. And Price had drawn a cartoon of a guy sitting on one of those vehicles with a couple in front, and he's passing by. There's a couple and a kid. He's passing by, and the guy's got a really loud print shirt on, and the woman has capris, and she has a flower on her rear end, like a big flower print on her rear end, and a hat with a feather, whatever it was. And maybe the guy had a straw pork pie. And this little boy that looked like a demon, he was dressed in a cowboy outfit. He had one gun out, and he just looked like he was, just the demon from hell, the little demon from hell. And the guy is asking the guide as he's going by, he says, "Hey, which way to the House of Good Taste, Mac?" Which was a pavilion. And it was hysterical. And I loved it. So.
And the guy said, "You'll never find her."
Well, it's in one of the collections. So, but what I did was
That's a great story. I never knew that.
And the kid
nice.
as my couple in that strip. I changed I gave the guy a Paisley shirt. I never liked Paisley, so I stuck that in there as part of his shirt. And we made the kid a good guy rather than being a demon from hell. But the couple really, and I've used them very rarely since then. Once in Thor, I forgot, once maybe somewhere else. Not very often, really. But that's where they came from. They came from that George Price cartoon of yesteryear.
Really so I think maybe we should show some more artwork and just talk about it as it comes, because we're
going to talk fast. I think we don't have much more time, right?
Well, Bill said we could go a little bit over. I think he said we had like another 15 minutes if we wanted it.
All right. Well,
fine.
We'll do some fast takes if we can.
So, Bill, how about showing the Alien page now? So, Walter, of course, you did the New York Times best-selling, which at that time was a real big deal, Alien book for who published that? Was that?
It was Heavy Metal.
That was Heavy Metal. Okay.
Yes, it was.
And to my mind, I don't think there's any argument here that this is the best movie adaptation ever done. Now, I know you're not going to agree with that because you're a humble guy, but I think everybody watching would agree with that, especially Steve, if he's watching. No, this was a tremendous book when it came out, and you teamed up again with your old friend Archie to do it, and just gorgeous stuff. Your work is. This was 1978,
78, end of 78, early 79 is when I did that. I think the movie came out in May of 79.
I mean, you're definitely, your style is definitely getting more refined, closer to what it is now. And again, this was just a beautiful, beautiful job. And also, didn't you and Wheezy also at least color part of this?
We did. I colored the first 8 pages, and then I realized I was not going to be able to color it all because there simply wasn't time. So I basically hired 3 women that I knew: Wheezy, a young woman named Deb Pedler, who had come out of Pratt, and Polly Law, who had worked up at Continuity for a while. I got to know Polly there. And so I hired the 3 of them to color it. And what was kind of fun was they each had a different sense of color key. Wheezy was much more sort of saturated, bright color. Polly was somewhere in the middle, and Deb had a very gray, downtone quality to her colors. And I gave the pages out in scenes so that when the color key changed, the scene itself would have changed. But what was interesting was it went along. The book was about 60 pages long. And by the time we were done, all 3 women had brought their colors more to a center place. So they were much less different than they had been in the early part. But it all worked out very well. And that was really a result. I mean, just that whole book. Heavy Metal was very, generous. And Charlie Lippincott, who just died, Charlie was a good guy. He was a liaison at 20th Century Fox. I think he was one of the principal guys responsible, made the difference for getting Star Wars at Marvel, for getting Alien and Heavy Metal. And he saw to it that I had a ton of visual reference. And Archie and I, between us, we had 3 different script revisions. Back then, nobody in the movie company cared much about the comic book adaptations. They sort of weigh on them much more now, look after them, and I would hesitate to use the word interfere, but maybe I would use that word. But they want stuff in it. They're very specific about it. And there's like likeness rights, lots of stuff that's going on now that was not happening back then. So we did not have to navigate likeness rights, which I would not be doing. I mean, that's a whole nother story. We'll know some of the review some other time. But the short porch version is that we had 3 script revisions, and we were free to use material from any of them. They weren't looking after us to see, it's got to be this, it's got to be that. So there are a couple of scenes in the comic that were not in the movie, but they were in earlier scripts. And there's one of them where Lambert and Ripley were discussing Ash, with Ian Holm character, this is a spoiler alert, who turns out to be an android. And they both mentioned earlier when they were discussing him, they wondered if either one of them had slept with him. And the answer was no. And they didn't really go anywhere else with that, but it was really a little foreshadowing when you discovered what Ash's true identity was. There's also a scene in there right at the end where Ripley is running through the corridor and trying to get to the lifeboat. She's already set Mother to blow the ship up. And she runs around the corner, and there's a box down in the hallway, and she sees it, and she stops, and the box unfolds, and it's the alien waiting in the directly in her path, and she has to run back and turn off Mother. That's in the movie in a different form. They went back, and I saw it was in the rough cut. I saw a rough cut of the film. It was about 2.5 hours long, and they reshot that. I say they, maybe Ridley Scott reshot it with a lot of strobe lights, all sorts of stuff that wasn't happening in the version I saw. And I didn't know it was going to be in or out. It was in, it was out, it was in. I was talking to Charlie, and I finally got to that part of the graphic novel. I had to know because it would change the page layouts for the remainder of the 6 pages I had left or whatever it was. And Charlie said, well, it's in. And I said, okay. So I drew it, and the movie came out, and I'm going, hey, where's that scene? And then I discovered years later, a few years ago, I discovered that apparently that scene is the focus of Alien fans' discussions about whether it was ever filmed or not. And there are a number of people who think it never was. And they think, and the only proof that it was, apparently, is in that comic book.
Right.
And I saw it, but I think I'm of the 4 guys I watched the movie with in the rough cut, I think I'm the only one still alive. So we're not going to be able to go back and get some corroborative testimony from anybody. But I can remember Michael Gross saying he thought it was pretty cheesy. Right. And I thought it was great. So go figure.
So in essence, we're talking about the director's cut.
Yeah, or something like that. Yeah, I think he must have gone nuts, not have liked it, and went back, and they did a lot more stuff to make the alien much more obscure with all the strobe lighting. But honestly, I thought it was great to see it. It was so scary.
No, that was a great movie, great comic. All right, why don't
we just had a lot of reference, and we had a lot of elbow room. And Archie knew how to make comics, so by that time I was pretty confident, and Archie was just the best. So
sure,
it worked out well.
All right, why don't we go? Let's have a look at the Battlestar Galactica cover and the Star Slammers cover. So the cover is the one you sent me, the Cylon Mark III.
That's right.
That's a great comic. I love
the issue I actually inked out of all the ones I did.
I love that comic, but that's also that's really the first comic you wrote, also professionally.
Well, it was mostly written by Roger McKenzie, who was the regular writer on the book when I took it over, and we worked together on all the issues I did up to that point. And then at the end of that issue, Roger left the book. There was some stuff going on inside the office, and he was kind of a casualty of that. You'd have to ask him for more details, really. But I ended up, I don't remember now if Roger had written the last couple of pages. We would have been working Marvel style, which means I would have done the art and the pencils anyway, and Roger would have written from that. And I went back I wrote about the last page and a half or 2.5 pages. I'd have to go look. From about the time I think that Apollo climbs down into the volcano, which in real life would have been awfully hot, but it is comics. So I did script those pages uncredited, and I think probably unpaid, but it was okay. But those are the first pages of any comic, of an actual interior of a comic I really wrote. Then I picked up the writing with the next issue. And that was my beginning of my writing career, really, was that the last 4 of the last 5 issues of that book. One of them was a fill-in, but the other 4 I wrote, and that was the beginning of my writing career. And I have to say it was aided and abetted by the fact that Archie liked what I had done. He complimented me in the hall one day about, I was walking by him, about those pages. And I have to tell you, for those who didn't know Archie or the business back in those days, getting a compliment from Archie was like being handed the Oscar as you were walking past in the hallway. It was just great. So it was really the launch pad for my writing career, because then he said, I got to write a movie, an adaptation for a movie. I'm really busy. Do you want to write it? And I said, I like those issues. They were great. Do you want to write it? And I said, yeah, sure. What the heck? I figured it's already a script. I'll just kind of plug in the words, which is kind of what I did. But, some movie nobody ever heard of called Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so I ended up writing the Raiders of the Lost Ark adaptation for Marvel, John Buscema and Klaus Janson. So you have to start writing somewhere. That's a good way to start writing.
Absolutely. I just heard from Bill. Bill, could you put on the Battlestar Galactica cover? Yeah. So again, this was such a fun comic that when you were doing it, and this particular issue, this episode was definitely my favorite. I never really went in much for licensed comics. I just, aside from things, well, I guess things that you did, like the Alien adaptation and Battlestar Galactica. I'm not really a fan of many others. And then to the right, we have from Malibu, I think, a issue of a cover of Star Slammers.
That was actually a cover I did for IDW. It was I did when you guys put out the floppies, the reprints of the Star Slammers. I did new covers for them, that was one of the new covers for one of the issues. Probably I don't remember issue 4 or 5. It's old Rojas, so it's got to be after issue 3, which is the graphic novel. Yeah, so somewhere in there. One thing about Galactica is that they didn't pay too much attention. Glenn Larson didn't pay too much attention to it, so we were able to do pretty much what we wanted to do on that book. And when we did the Cylon Mark III story, I inked it. Marvel did not have likeness rights, and so we weren't supposed to be drawing the actual actors. I still did, but I'm not a big likeness guy, so I used the actual likenesses as the springboard to do drawings of the characters without trying to be particularly accurate to it. And but they got complaints. But Weezy was the editor at that point, and she got complaints back from Larson that Apollo looked too much like the actor, Richard Hatch. And they were grousing about that. And we kind of, there was something about it that was a little weird. So we kind of fumfered around for a bit. We cheated with the Glenn Larson company. And eventually, 2 things happened. One was that she discovered that they didn't really mean Apollo. They meant Adama, the Lauren Green character. They couldn't keep it straight. So they were giving us the wrong one. And the second that happened was, don't tell anybody, it just went out unchanged. We didn't bother changing. We just set it out. And they come back to us and they were crabby with us later on. At the very end, there was a bit in the volcano, which I totally swiped from Hal Foster. Speaking of swipe, there's a story bit at the end. I totally swiped from one of the relatively early Prince Valiants, where it's actually, I feel okay because Jack Kirby swiped from that same story. The demon has that chicken he puts over, Val put a chicken over his head to look like a demon. And I didn't swipe the chicken, but in that sequence, there's a sequence where Val has to escape guys by climbing along a ledge, and he leaves a cord attached to the wall, to the window or whatever. And as he's going along the ledge, the guy's coming after him. Eventually, he leaps out into space, and the cord pulls the guy off the ledge and drops him, and Val's able to slam against the castle wall, pull himself back up, and I totally stole that from Hal.
I want to jump in and tell a very quick funny story. You were talking about likenesses. There was a book that I edited at IDW, and it was a licensed property, and I got back notes on one specific character, and the notes were that the face needed to change on this character because he was too puffy and gaunt, and I think I just said, okay, all right, we'll take care of it. And then I didn't know what to do, so I finally just sent back the very same piece of artwork to the person who gave that, and she said, much better, thanks.
I did a RoboCop Terminator book with Frank in, what was that, 1990 or thereabouts, and Dark Horse published it. They did not have the rights to use Peter Weller's likeness, and I went ahead and drew him anyway. But again, my likenesses are only so-so. I wasn't pushing to get a good likeness, and I mostly didn't. I got something that was passable. And in the last issue of the job, there was a kind of a dream mirage sequence that RoboCop, I've forgotten his name as a human being, but he's in a dream where he's back to being human again. And the Terminators are trying to kind of seduce him over to the dark side. And at some point, he does like that. He's screaming with his finger pointing. Might be the other finger, I don't remember. And I did not have any photos of Peter Weller screaming. And when people scream, their faces really change. So I just made up a complete face. And it's not very big. In the actual original, it's probably no bigger than that. And that was the face. They came back and said, well, you got to change this face. This is too much like Peter Weller. And we just thought, I thought, really? Of all the faces I did, this is the one face I would say owes nothing to Peter Weller other than maybe the hair. So we said, all right, we'll change it.
That's funny.
Okay, we changed it. Sent it back. Never heard back from him.
Of course. All right, why don't we, Bill, if you don't mind, let's have a look at the the Dr. Fate and Metalman slide. Because these are a couple of early-ish jobs. I think Dr. Fate was first, right? Because that was from first issue special.
That's right.
And then that's the splash from the first Metalman you did, which was a really cool story. It was kind of I like the later issues you did too, but I was sorry that Steve Gerber had left after the first issue.
He actually had left already. The issue, that script was sitting in a drawer somewhere as an inventory issue. Steve was already back at Marvel by the time I drew it. So I never actually, I knew Steve, fairly casually, I didn't know him well, but he was already back at Marvel by the time I was drawing it. And he and I never talked directly about the job itself.
But it was, your whole run on Metalman was just a fun, cool, kind of a departure for you in a way that I really enjoyed. And
it was very cartoony. Really, the characters lent themselves to cartooning in a way that Manhunter did not, or Dr. Fate did not. And I took advantage of that. And
the Dr. Fate story was also a really nifty one too. I really got a kick out of it. I'm gonna go through these a little bit faster now, just because we are over the time limit. How about Thor, Bill? So, I debated whether I should show the 337 cover, just because it's the 337 cover. Everybody knows that cover. But it's such a great cover, and it was so groundbreaking in its day. And you don't see it here, but one of the things I really loved about it was the way it completely shattered the logo. That Beta Ray Bill just shattered it. That was great.
That was, I know, the idea came, that's what I did. The drawing on the right, well, it's the right for me, I guess for everybody, with Bill holding a hammer over his head. That's the very first drawing of Bill that I ever did. I don't normally do model sheets for characters. I just try to draw finishes. I go back and alter them some if I have to, but mostly I don't. So that's the first drawing of Bill, and that was for a poster. So the original drawing is probably at least 2 feet high. And on the logo, the only thing I'll say about that is that I did not know this at the time. I did it. I just did it because that was a cool way to do a logo and do an introduction to the character. And I had Alex J., who was a wonderful designer, a freelance designer, did the new Thor logo for me, based a little more on Celtic and Northern European letter forms. That was the only logo Marvel had left from their original days.
Oh, wow.
Every other logo had been changed by that time. And the FF, they had gone back to the original logo, but it had been a different logo at least, I think, twice, maybe more than that. And so when I broke the Thor logo, the other thing was, it really was breaking the last vestige of the old graphic design from the first, years of Marvel.
All right, then let's go to Lawnmower Man, because that's kind of also a departure for you, and something that I think a lot of people haven't seen. This was this published in Marvel Preview?
No, I think it was called Bizarre. Was it Bizarre Adventures? I think.
Bizarre
I have to look
Adventures.
it up
That's
myself
That's
now.
it. Yeah.
But it was they got the
And what's
right
interesting about
King short story, and that was the one that they chose. Denny was the editor.
yeah, but who was?
What? Denny was the editor.
Who was the editor?
Denny O'Neill.
And right, and this particular job, you didn't write the adaptation. It's actually, wasn't it written by King?
Yes, it was. It was actually written by King. In fact, one of the things that killed me, two things about the story. One was I really went into a Sergio Topi mode at the time. I discovered Topi's work some years earlier, actually.
I was actually going to ask you
black and white story. I really delved heavily into his approach to line and tone. The other thing is that it was done Marvel style. So I drew all the pages in pencil. They mailed them off to Stephen King, wherever he lives. I never dealt with Stephen myself, never talked to him, never had any communication with him. But Denny sent it off, and it came back, and he had written a script, and I have to say, did a great job. He fleshed out as much stuff as needed to be fleshed out for a comic versus, say, a short story. Really well done. I mean, he's a good writer, so what do you expect? But not everybody makes that transition that quickly. And however, no one had explained it to him. So what he did was he wrote all of his copy, dialogue, captions, whatever it was. They were all written on the artwork around sort of in the margins and then or between the panels. And so what that meant was they got it all lettered, got transcribed, got it lettered. And then when I inked the pages, I had to go through and erase all of the Stephen King writing. And it just killed me. Just killed me. And I have at least one page. I don't remember which one. I don't know if it's that one or not. I don't see anything at the bottom. There was at least one page where the writing was a little below the trim line. And so I just left it there. So I have at least one page that Stephen King has actually written on. And you can see it. But I'd be hard pressed to prove it. I never asked Stephen for a certificate of authenticity. So
that's awesome. Hey, hey, Bill, are we? Do we have to go, or do we still have a few more minutes?
I'd say you can do another 5 minutes. How's that?
Awesome, thanks.
Very generous. Thank you.
All right, then let's try to get through the rest of the art.
I'll talk faster.
All right. How about X-Men Teen Titans?
Tons of fun. That was done by Marvel. Wheezy was the editor. And the way it was working by that time was that it went to DC started, then Marvel, then DC, then Marvel. There were 4 of them in that run, more or less. And when it was somebody's turn, like Marvel's turn in this book, the idea was to use Marvel talent and have DC have a liaison officer, more or less, looking after it. So Len Wein was liaison for DC, and Wheezy used Marvel talent. I believe since that time, George Perez, every so often I send him a web going, boy, I sure wish George had drawn this. I appreciate that, but too bad. George was doing the Teen Titans. So, and he was also, was a DC guy at that time. So he wasn't really one of the options. Dave Cockham would have been the original choice because he was the X-Men editor and he was doing the X-Men at that point, but he was not fast enough to do the X-Men and to do a 64-page comic in addition in the middle of doing a monthly book. So they were debating about who should be doing the drawing. I came into the office one day, Wheezy and Chris were sitting in her office talking about it. And as I came in and walked by, or maybe when I walked by the door, I heard them going, mumble, 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 X-Men Teen Titans, mumble, mumble, Dark Side. And I spun around, finger in the air and said, hey, if you're doing Dark Side, I'm drawing this comic book. And that is sort of how it happened. So I got to draw it. That's the source wall. Kirby had invented the source, and he invented I've forgotten the name of the galaxy now, the Galaxy of the Gargantuas or whatever it was called, of these giant figures strapped to the remnants of their machines when they had tried to breach the end of the universe and get into the source. And they had failed, and they were now these giant creatures strapped, heart beating once every, 5 centuries. And Chris and I liked the idea, and we expanded that to make an actual wall with some of the heads of some of the characters who had tried to breach the wall and failed, stuck in this great wall. And what was kind of fun about that is that's become part of the DC continuity. But that's the first drawing of the wall anybody had ever done. And Terry Austin, who was the inker in that book, did a phenomenal job. Everybody else in that team was the regular X-Men folks. Wheezy was editing, Chris wrote it, Terry inked it. Tom Orzechowski lettered it, and Glennis Ween, or maybe been Glennis Oliver by then, was lettering it. Or was coloring it. I'm sorry. So it really was except for me, I was the sport of nature in that job.
It's funny. It's funny on this one because I'm a member of a Facebook group about 1980s and newer comics, and there was kind of an argument about what the best crossover was in comics, and the guy I was talking to, who were messaging back and forth on the page, it was his contention that Superman, Spider-Man was the best, and I just said, you're crazy. That's fine, but X-Men Teen Titans, you got to go with X-Men Teen Titans. So he was so sure that nobody agreed with me that he actually did one of those Facebook polls.
Oh,
and it was like, Superman, Spider-Man, 8 votes, and then the rest were all below, except X-Men Teen Titans, which was like 50, because it is.
The advantage of the Superman Spider-Man crossover that Jerry and Ross and Neil and did Dick ink that? The advantage of that one was it was the first one.
Right.
So you'd never seen something like that before. And that was very exciting at the time.
It was. Anyway, let's try to wrap it up a little bit. So let's go to X Factor, and then after that, Fantastic Four.
Okay.
So, I just love these covers that you did. You did a series on X Factor, and these are just great, especially, the Phoenix cover is just beautiful. And it's funny that you didn't draw in the art where the logo would go. I'm kind of surprised by that.
It's possible. I don't remember now. Usually I get comics back, I take the logo off. It was always rubber cemented on. You can see on the X Factor cover, it's a little yellow up in there. And actually back on that Battlestar Galactica, it was very yellow. The rubber cement destroys the paper eventually. It's acidic and it turns the paper yellow. So usually I got the artwork back, which is about 9 months after I turned it in. That was the usual turnaround. I would use rubber cement and I would clean the logos off. So it's entirely possible, and quite likely actually, I may have done that cover with the logo already in place. I don't think I would have just ended it like that and tried to figure out how much of it I would draw and not hit the logo. So I'm pretty sure the logo and the corner box are already there when I was inking that particular cover.
What about, let's move on to Fantastic Four then.
Actually, one more note about that X Factor cover before it disappears, which is 2 things. One, the costume colors, if you go back and look at them, blue, red, brown, and then Iceman, were really, the idea for that was earth, air, fire, and water. I'll leave you to figure out which one's which, but that's where the colors came from. And the other thing is, that's the third of 3 covers that was the crossover or the Fall of the Mutants. And if you go back, I say this at conventions, but so some people know this already. Those 3 covers fit together as a triptych.
Oh, nice.
And if you put them together, that little bit of hardware above Iceman, that is Ship. It was this giant spaceship the X Factor had for a while. Ship runs across all 3 covers.
Oh, nice.
It was not, the 3 covers were not colored in a way that made that obvious. They were all colored separately and without thinking about that. There is a complete version somewhere on the web. Chris Sotomayor went back and did a color version of all 3 of them unified. So you can, if you look, you'll be able to find what they look like. But they were the first shot of Archangel flying out of the front, and then there's a shot of Apocalypse holding Jean, I think, by the hair, and then this shot of the team themselves. And those 3 covers make one big picture. I'm done.
Very cool. All right, FF then. Yeah.
Hugely fun. I had been doing the Avengers, writing the Avengers. I wrote it for almost a year for John and John Buscema, Tom Palmer. We had a great time. I loved working with those guys. But Marvel was just starting to get into continuity as the rule of law. And so I kept running into stories where they'd say, oh, well, you can't use Thor in this issue because he's off in space in his own comic. And I kind of like to play a long game and do kind of line stories up. And I kept finding that I had to do my stories on the fly in order to accommodate continuity in somebody else's book, which I wasn't thrilled about. So eventually I began bending the Avengers around, or I would have several Avengers who were not in other comics. But by the time I got to the end of that, there was more editorial, I will say interference. Screw it, it's a long time ago. What do I care? And I reached the point where I just thought, I can't do this anymore. I can't make this work if I have to change stuff every time I turn around. So I got off I had put Thor and Iron Man they were in the Avengers. Then I think I took Thor out, maybe Iron Man too. And then suddenly, right after I got offered the FF, and I had put Reed and Sue into the Avengers because I thought it would be really interesting to have two people with the habit of command like Reed and Captain America butting heads. But they were pulled out of the book 2 issues after I put them in. They were in there for good, and then suddenly, oh no, they're not. So they went back in the FF. I understood that. I didn't mind doing that, having them in the FF. But then I got offered the FF to write. Reed and Sue were back in it. I got the original characters. And so because it wasn't continuity in that sense, I got to guest star Iron Man and Thor. And then I got to pick up. And so some of the stuff I did in the early issues of the FF were stories I would have done in the Avengers if I'd still been on the Avengers and able to do it the way I wanted to. But I was able to do that stuff in the FF. Worked out fine.
Yeah. And then the last slide we have.
And that's my parody of Image Comics on the right. Well, everybody holding very large guns.
Right. And have lots of little pockets. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Last one is Ragnarok.
Oh, okay. Hey, my favorite comic.
Mine too.
At the moment.
Yeah.
I've gone back to Thor for 25 years, 30 years now, 35 years. Thanks to Scott Dunbier, who almost 20 years ago said, hey, wouldn't you like to do your own comic with the Norse myths? And I said, sure, let me finish up some work first, and I'll get back to you. And 15 years later, I got back to him. And I had an idea for I didn't want to do Marvel's Thor. I'm not going to do Marvel's Thor. I don't want to hear lawyers knocking on my door. But I tried to think of what to do with a character like that, or what to do with the Norse myth in general. And ultimately, I decided that I would I want to tell stories that don't feel like they've been told before. So I'm telling a story about what happens after Ragnarok has occurred. And the bad guys won. Thor wasn't at the battle for reasons we don't fully understand yet. And there are 18 issues out so far. And Thor has come back from wherever he was, discovered that his family, his world, Asgard have all been destroyed. The 9 worlds have collapsed into a vast land with the sun and the moon inside giant wolf carcasses rotting away and shining twilighty light through the Dusklands. And Thor has picked up his hammer and he's going out of the Dusklands to find the great enemies and deal with them. So as long as he is still alive, Ragnarok is still ongoing.
Oh, okay. I forgot about this. So when we were launching the new series of Ragnarok, the 3rd series, Stan Sakai was launching his Usagi Yojimbo comic at IDW, and I had this crazy idea that we could do a jam cover, because Stan wanted Walter to do a variant cover, and I thought, well, why don't we do a jam cover? And so this actually is Stan and Walter. You can see that Stan did Thor and Walter did Usagi, and then it's all a mix in between. Actually, Walter, I can never remember where your signature is on this. I mean, it's really hidden.
At this scale, I have no idea.
Yeah, it is there though. It is there.
Yes,
I asked you why you didn't sign it, and then you said, "Oh no, it's signed."
It's signed. It's over there somewhere.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
This was a layout. Stan did the layout, and then he inked Thor, and then parts of the rest of the cover, and then I inked all the stuff he had not done. So the figure right in the center is getting his head handed to him. I think I drew the head. Stan drew most of that character's armor. And then everything else is kind of split. I did ask at the time if Stan wanted me to do his Usagi, because I could do that. He had a layout for it. It would have been easy to have done the Usagi and his. You asked me the same question. And then he said, no, I want you to do your Usagi. So that's really.
Of course. I think you asked Weezy and me and a couple other people, and I think everybody said, no, you do it.
That's right. I said, okay, well, I'm good with that. So that was my version of Usagi on this cover.
Am I wrong, or is the tail by both of you?
The tail?
Yeah.
Of the serpent? Yes. Yeah, Stan inked about half of it. I've forgotten where it ended. And then I inked the other half. If you go back and find the comic this is in, Scott can tell you where it is. I'd have made me on the web. There is a key in the back of the comic that shows this drawing with all the line work in one of 2 colors, either blue or red. and all of one color is the stuff that I inked, and all of the other color is the stuff that Stan inked. It was fun. I'm a huge Stan Sakai Usagi Yojimbo fan. That's my favorite comic in the modern world, and so I was thrilled to be able to work with Stan and do a jam cover.
And both Walter and Stan very kindly and graciously donated the original comic art to a charity art auction at San Diego.
Wait, year. What? What happened to that? That was happy to do it.
Yeah, that was nice. Bill, we should probably wrap this up, huh?
Yeah, that sounds good. You guys have been fantastic. I mean, easily the best attended panel of the weekend so far. So thank you both so much for doing this. This is
so our royalty check will be pretty good. All right.
It was our pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, thank you, Walter. And it, like I said, it's great seeing you. It's been about 15 years since I had you. You were at a show here in Ohio that I
oh wow, I haven't been back to Ohio in a while, but I enjoyed going out there. It was fun. And as Scott will tell you, I enjoy talking. So this was really easy.
I might have mentioned that to Bill earlier already.
Well, that's why I felt like, all right, we can run long a little bit today. And
actually, you know, it's really funny, Walter. I know you don't remember this because why would you? But I thought it was the funniest thing. But one time I called you, and you were talking to somebody else, and you clicked over, and you said, "Oh, hang on just a second," and then you came back. Should I mention the person's name? It's kind of.
I don't know the story, so I can't tell you.
You clicked. You were gone for like 10 seconds, and then you came back and you said, "Oh, thanks. I love him, but I was talking to Dan Brereton. That guy can really talk." And I laughed so much when you told me that, because you guys make me look like someone who doesn't talk a lot, which takes. That's hard.
Silent Scott.
Huh?
Silent Scott.
Yeah, well, maybe not silent, but if it's okay with you, Bill, can I show something that's not Walter related? I wanted just to
sure.
Show the I have an artist edition coming up, the Jim Lee X-Men one, and this is the cover of it that is printed and getting ready to be bound. And then this over here is the cover of the signed and numbered variant, and that'll be coming out the same day. And also, anyway, that's it on that. Okay.
Very nice. Everyone's looking forward to it.
No, I'm just glad it's done.
Oh, good.
But
all right.
Any closing words, Walter?
No, just all those folks who are hanging out listening. Hope you're entertained. Hope you learned something, or maybe not. And thanks for being here. And Scott, thanks for having me. Thanks for the chat. Bill, thanks for putting this on.
It's almost like one of our regular talks, kind of. But
all right. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hey, there's a panel going on with Matt Wagner right now, too. So when this is over, hop on over to that and chat with Matt. Thanks, guys.